right, so the way we're going to tackle the rest of the Cold War is we're going to go about it in 20-year chunks. So this time we'll talk about 1945 to 1965, next time we'll talk 1965 to 1985, and then we'll talk 1985 to the present. And we're going to start with the political history of the Soviet Union and then Western Europe, and then we'll talk about trends in society and culture. All right, so we're going to start with the Soviet Union. We're going to fast forward all the way back to the end of World War II. And as we know, right, we talked about this when we talked about the consequences of World War II. World War II was really economically devastating, especially for countries like the Soviet Union that experienced war on their soil, right? But the Soviet Union actually was able to bounce back pretty quickly after the end of the war. So industrial production, for example, recovered to pre-war levels by 1947, and then just continued to grow. The Soviet Union also made a lot of technological progress. So we know, for example, they got nuclear weapons, and they also developed the world's first satellite. And we'll talk a little bit about the space race next time because it's sort of precursor to that. But there were some underlying problems here. So the Soviet Union really focused on developing military technology and heavy industry. So kind of industry that was geared towards building more industry. So building, factories and, tractors and things like that versus focusing on consumer goods. So things that people could actually use in their own homes. So the problem with this was that the average Soviet citizen, even though the economy recovered, the average Soviet citizen didn't really see the benefits of that, right? So there were still things like shortages at the grocery store, like people didn't have enough food to eat sometimes, there were housing shortages. So for the average Soviet citizen, unless you were a member of the Communist Party, life wasn't super great. And moreover, the Soviet Union remained a totalitarian state. So Stalin continued to maintain those really repressive policies and actually was almost about to carry out another purge, but he died in 1953. So that ended that. All right. Now, Stalin was actually succeeded by someone who tried to reverse a lot of his policies, even though they had actually kind of been a lackey of Stalin when Stalin was alive. So this is Nikita Khrushchev. You can see him here. This is my absolute favorite photo of him holding an ear of corn. That will be relevant in a second. And what Khrushchev did is he introduced a bunch of reforms aimed at de-Stalinization, or basically making the USSR a bit less totalitarian. So one way I've heard this described is the Soviet Union under Khrushchev went from a totalitarian state where the government has all the power to an authoritarian state where the government has most of the power, but it's not quite at the same level as a totalitarian state. So Khrushchev, when he became premier of the Soviet Union, he actually gave a speech openly denouncing Stalin at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956. So he turns around, he looks at the other Soviet elite, and he's like, how about we not do what Stalin did? And they're like, okay. So what reforms did Khrushchev actually undertake? Well, he limited censorship a little bit. So some things that were critical of Stalin could be published, less so of Khrushchev. He closed some of the Gulag camps, but not all. He did reduce the power of the secret police, which at this point is called the KGB. If that name rings a bell to you if you like to watch spy movies. He reduced the power and privileges of the Communist Party elite, which they were not happy about. And then he invested in the production of consumer goods and especially housing. So he built a lot of new housing. And when we say consumer goods, like one thing that he was really interested in was washing machines. I remember that from my Soviet history classes. So, well, now you don't have to wash clothes by hand. Maybe Khrushchev will get you a washing machine. So that's pretty positive. He also tried to increase food production. This was not very successful. So he tried to farm corn because he went to the United States and he saw that we were farming corn, so why can't the Soviet Union? But the problem was he tried to farm corn in Siberia. And as you can imagine, this didn't work. Corn does not grow in Siberia, despite some attempts at Soviet biological engineering. So that pretty much failed. So these failures, the farming policy especially, the Cuban Missile Crisis was an issue, the fact that Khrushchev deprived some of the party elite of their privileges, all of that ended up making him really unpopular with the Communist Party elite, and they kind of shuffled him out of power after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he did try. Right. The problem there, though, was, too, that Khrushchev's reforms didn't really extend to the rest of the Eastern Bloc. So Khrushchev, when he denounced Stalin, it seems like there was a big sea change, so it inspired protests in Poland. People hoped that their government would implement similar reforms, and their leader, so Gomulka, he actually did pledge, he said, Poland's going to follow its own socialist path. We don't need to be totalitarian like the Soviet Union, but he still pledged to remain loyal to the Warsaw Pact. Now, Hungary, they went a step further. So their their leader, Imre Nagy, he actually went so far as to promise free and fair elections, right? Which we know is something that Stalin didn't want to happen. And this was so big that it's actually sometimes called the Hungarian Revolution, even though they didn't this is perceived as like an outright revolt. Now, Khrushchev sees this happening, and he is not ready to let Hungary go from the Eastern Bloc. So he did invade Hungary, and he crushed the revolt. And yeah, so limits of Khrushchev's reforms there. And this is a picture from that, by the way. You can see some Hungarians breaking down a statue of Stalin. Now, this part of the Eastern Bloc kind of tried to break free. But what's important to note is that not all of Eastern Europe was actually under sort of the Soviet Eastern Bloc. Some actually did they were independent. And the only example of this really is Yugoslavia, which was a communist state in the Balkans. So it is in Eastern Europe, but it's not part of the Eastern Bloc, even though it is communist. So their leader, Tito, which is this stern-looking guy right here, he pursued kind of his own version of communism that was a little bit more decentralized, a little bit less totalitarian, and Yugoslavia continued kind of doing its own thing separate from the Eastern Bloc until the 1990s. All right, so now we're going to turn our attention to Western Europe. So there's a couple of general trends here that I want you to make note of. So the first one is actually like the Soviet Union, Western Europe experienced some pretty significant economic recovery, even more so than the Soviet Union. And this was all thanks to the Marshall Plan, which is that big infusion of cash that the United States gave them. Another really big trend is the growth of what we call the welfare state. In Western Europe, governments basically invested a lot in the production of consumer goods. They invested in a lot of social programs like healthcare and welfare and things like that. And all of this combined to sort of make life a lot better for the average person. And we'll talk about the impact that had. Another really big trend is a move towards unity. So after basically 2 world wars, right? Western Europe is like, well, what can we do to prevent that? How about we get together? So NATO, that military alliance with the United States brought them together militarily. And then we're going to see some Western European countries begin to move together economically. So they signed some free trade agreements, and then they created a free trade zone called the European Economic Community. And this is actually really similar. If you remember, this is how German unification started, with a currency union. So this wasn't a currency union. They were all using their own different currencies, but it was a free trade zone. So it brought them together because it brought them together economically. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through sort of country by country, and we're going to start with France. So the leader of France after World War II was a World War II resistance leader named Charles de Gaulle. And if you've been to France, there's an airport named after him, so it indicates kind of how important he is. One of his policies was he really wanted to make France strong again. So he spent on France's defense budget. He actually made France a nuclear power, but because France had lost a lot of its colonies and they'd been invaded during World War II, which is kind of damaging for their image, they didn't really rise to the world power status again. So the Vietnam War, for example, that really hit them hard, the first Vietnam War, because they lost Indochina, so that hit them hard. Now, in terms of domestic policy, France nationalized, which means to bring under state control. It's actually a very left-wing policy. A lot of industries, but this didn't really end up benefiting France's economy all that much. It led to a lot of government deficits because they had spent all that money buying the industries, and it led to higher prices as well. All right, so let's turn to Britain now. So Britain also implemented a lot of government control over the economy. And this was because that after World War II, the party that took charge was the left-leaning Labour Party. So they're not communists, but they are kind of on the left side of the political spectrum. And it was actually pretty successful. So Britain, like France, nationalized a lot of industries, including transportation and utilities, to ensure that ordinary people would have access to things like transportation and electricity and things like that, right? Britain really famously expanded their welfare state. They established, for example, a national health program called the National Health Service, as well as a social security program. Now, this, again, pretty much most historians agree that this made sort of everyday life better for British people. But it was really expensive, and it forced Britain to abandon its overseas colonies and then really contributed to Britain's debt. So kind of Britain, like France, they really lose their world power status at the end of World War II. Again, now the game's really the United States and the Soviet Union. So now let's look at West Germany. So again, Germany's divided in half, so let's look at the western side. So in contrast to Britain and France, after West Germany becomes independent, so after they sort of not free themselves, after Western occupation ends, or Allied occupation ends rather, Germany took kind of a more rightward tack, or West Germany did. So their Chancellor Konrad Adenauer lowered taxes, and he limited government intervention in the economy in contrast to Britain and France. Now, another really big thing that West Germany had to contend with was their history during World War II. So they continue to sort of denazify Germany, and they put former Nazis on trial for war crimes. All right, so now let's do some social history, and we'll talk about sort of how Western European society changed during sort of this post-war period. So one of the biggest things that we'll see is the growth of a consumer society. So this is all due to that economic growth after World War II, thanks Marshall Plan. This increased the size of the middle class, it increased wages among the working class, and it encouraged more and more people to move to cities. So we see here like a rising tide lifting all boats. Now that's happening, right? And on the other side, we see a lot of new technological developments happening. And what this does is kind of like what happened during the Industrial Revolution. It made it easier and cheaper to buy a whole variety of consumer goods. So washing machines, refrigerators, televisions, and then really the big kind of symbol of post-war recovery was the car, right? So now cars are accessible to a lot more people. They can purchase them. They're more affordable. So these two developments basically contribute to the rise of this consumer society. So everybody's buying stuff, they're feeling good, they're feeling optimistic. So even poorer Europeans could access a pretty good standard of living. And these developments also contributed to a sort of rise in mass tourism and mass leisure. So now that we've got cars, we've got like drive-in theaters and stuff like that. So life is generally pretty good. Right. We're also going to see a role in the change of women. So right after World War II, there was a really big baby boom. So if you have ever heard the term boomer, that's actually where that comes from. It's from people born during this baby boom. And then actually, just as a side note, there was a baby boom in the Soviet Union and the United States for that matter. So this was something that a lot of people experienced after World War II. Now that did end up leveling off a little bit, especially after the introduction of the birth control pill in the 1960s. So the birth rate in the 1960s does start to decline. So the birth control pill plus labor-saving devices like washing machines meant that a lot more married women could join the workforce. So women start to work in larger and larger numbers. I know you have that stereotypical like 1950s housewife thing going on, but it's actually that's not quite the whole story. Now, women still held kind of typically like female jobs, secretaries and telephone operators and teachers and things like that. They tended to earn less than men, and even when women worked outside the home, they were still expected to shoulder the childcare and housework burden at home. Now, by this time, most women did have the vote. So some people will look at this and say, well, women had kind of political and legal equality, but they didn't have kind of full social and economic equality. And we'll see how that develops next lecture. All right, now let's turn our attention to culture. So let's talk about some general trends first. So kind of like in that interwar period between World War I and World War II, a lot of the art and literature of this post-war period was a direct response to this sense of meaningless and loss that occurred as a result of World War II. So art and literature, or a second trend, art and literature continued to move further away from depicting the world in a realistic way. So it's art kind of getting more abstract. The United States is actually going to become the center of the cultural world, now that they're also kind of center of the political world. And this was partly due to the fact that a lot of European artists actually fled there during the war. So there's that too, in addition to the fact that, well, the United States is the world power now. So that's happening as well. All right, let's talk about visual art. So one of the trends or art movements we need to associate with this period is abstract expressionism. And this is one of the really big art movements that actually emerged from the United States, though it does spread to Europe. So it was really abstract. And there's kind of two really big variants. There's action painting, which is like splatters, and then like just fields of solid color, which is called color field painting. So this guy up here, this is Jackson Pollock, and he's a really big innovator in that action painting style, which is, you can see here all the splatters. So the purpose of this art was to kind of convey this sense of spontaneity or invoke a sense of contemplation. That's what those big solid color canvases are like. You just look at them on your computer screen, you're like, it's a block of red, but it's different seeing it in person. So that's one movement. And then another movement is pop art, which you guys might be familiar with as well. It tends to be pretty well, people know it a lot. So this movement, basically what it did is it took works from pop culture and this new consumer culture, so like all these mass-produced products, and then depicted them in this kind of like detached, ironic way in order to create fine art. So it's like applying the techniques of fine art to like pop culture. So a name we need to associate here, the Andy Warhol, and he is the one who painted these Campbell soup cans, which he was famous for. All right, so let's talk about literature. So literature, again, this is an area where you really see authors grappling with World War II and all the sort of the implications of that. So there's this trend called theater of the absurd. And then some books were like direct responses to the war. So there's this book by this German author named Günter Grass called The Tin Drum, and it's very surreal. It's kind of all about sort of working through German war guilt. There's another book called Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mann that's really similar. Some American authors got in on this. So there's an author I really like named Kurt Vonnegut, and he wrote this book called Slaughterhouse-Five, and a really big part of that book is the narrator dealing with his PTSD after seeing the bombing of Dresden. So lots of books kind of dealing with war directly, but in kind of like this surreal, kind of abstract way. Philosophy also sees some new movements emerge during this time. And the really big trend here was this thing called existentialism, which actually had its roots before the war, but really kind of came into full bloom after the war. So it really sought to find meaning in like this seemingly absurd world. So it's grappling again with that sort of absurdity sense of meaninglessness after World War II. It was really inspired by someone we've already met before, this 19th century philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche. And some people actually will call Nietzsche an existentialist, but it's kind of fuzzy since existentialism is kind of partly about responding to World War II, and he was dead way before World War II, so it kind of depends how you want to categorize it. So the existentialists believed that, kind of like Nietzsche did, the world is meaningless, quote unquote, God is dead. So what that means, right, is there's no external source of meaning or morals out there in the world. There's no God telling you what's good and what's bad, right? What the existentialists believed is that instead it's kind of your responsibility as an individual to give life meaning and purpose. So they're all about sort of, again, existing, right? So what that meant was that you sort of identify or define your identity, define your morals, define yourself through your actions and your choices. And they were really big about living kind of like this authentic life. I'm going to list off the names here, and then we'll figure out what country that you would suspect most existentialists are from. So Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and then Simone de Beauvoir. So existentialism, really big with French people. And then just as a side note, Simone de Beauvoir, a very famous feminist philosopher, as well as very famous existentialist philosopher. So she kind of worked in two fields. It was kind of all about living your authentic life and what role does gender play in that. So if you're interested in this is a super brief overview, as things tend to be in this class, but existentialist philosophers are really readable, a lot more so than like when we were John Stuart Mill and some of the Enlightenment philosophers and stuff like that. So if you're interested in it, I really recommend you check out these philosophers. They're actually pretty fun to read. And we'll end on that note.